What if I told you that a charming law student who worked at a crisis hotline, helped write crime prevention pamphlets, was so charming that women would willingly get into his car even when police warnings were everywhere, and even saved a drowning child, was actually America's most cunning serial killer? This is the disturbing reality of Theodore Robert Bundy, a man who used his charisma as a weapon and his intelligence as a shield while committing some of the most heinous crimes in American history. Between 1974 and 1978, Bundy terrorized multiple states, leaving behind a trail of at least 30 confirmed victims, though experts believe the true number could be much higher. His story isn't just about murder, it's about deception, manipulation, and how a monster can hide in plain sight. Today, we're going to uncover the complete story of Ted Bundy, from his troubled childhood to his final moments on death row, including recent DNA developments that continue to solve cold cases decades after his execution. But be warned, this story reveals the darkest capabilities of human nature, and it is not about glorifying violence, crimes, and criminals. It's about learning how to recognize dangerous patterns and protect ourselves and our communities. That said, let's start from the beginning. Theodore Robert Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, but his very identity was built on a lie from day one. Born as Theodore Robert Cowell to Eleanor Louise Cowell at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont, Ted's biological father remains a mystery to this day. His original birth certificate listed different potential fathers, sometimes Lloyd Marshall, a salesman and Air Force veteran, sometimes listed as unknown. Louise claimed she met a war veteran named Jack Worthington who abandoned her when she became pregnant. Some family members whispered darker suspicions that Samuel Cowell, Louise's own father, might have been Ted's biological father. However, in 2020, psychiatrist Dorothy Otno-Lewis revealed that DNA testing had ruled out incest, though the true father's identity remains unknown. For the first 3 years of his life, Ted lived in Philadelphia's Roxborough neighborhood with his maternal grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell. But here's where the deception that would define his life began. Ted was told that his grandparents were his parents and his mother was his older sister. This elaborate lie was designed to avoid the social stigma of illegitimate birth in the 1940s. The truth about his parentage would haunt Ted throughout his life. Different accounts exist about how he discovered it. He told some people a cousin called him a bastard and showed him his birth certificate, while he told others he found it himself. True crime writer and Rule, who knew Ted personally, believed he didn't learn the truth until 1969. Ted expressed lifelong resentment toward his mother for this deception, feeling betrayed that he had to discover his true parentage on his own. Ted's early family life was far from stable. His grandfather Samuel Cowell was described in different ways by different people, creating a confusing picture. In some interviews, Ted spoke warmly of Samuel, saying he identified with and respected his grandfather. However, later testimonies painted a much darker picture. Family members described Samuel as a tyrannical bully who beat his wife and dog, tortured neighborhood cats by swinging them by their tails, and expressed racist attitudes. They claimed he once threw his daughter Julia down a flight of stairs for oversleeping and would speak to unseen presences, flying into violent rages when Ted's paternity was questioned. Ted's grandmother was described as timid, periodically undergoing electroconvulsive therapy for depression, and eventually becoming afraid to leave the house. Interestingly, these dark descriptions have been questioned by more recent investigations. Some neighbors remembered Samuel as a fine man and expressed bewilderment at reports of violence. Family members suggested these characterizations were convenient explanations for Ted's later behavior rather than accurate descriptions. In 1950, Louise moved to Tacoma, Washington, with 3-year-old Ted. The following year, she married Johnny Culpepper Bundy, who formally adopted Ted. Despite Johnny's attempts to include Ted in family activities, Ted remained distant and later complained that Johnny wasn't his real father and wasn't very bright. Even as a young child, Ted exhibited deeply disturbing behavior. His Aunt Julia recalled waking from a nap to find 3-year-old Ted standing by her bed, smiling, having surrounded her with kitchen knives. A childhood neighbor, Sandy Holt, remembered Ted as a mean-spirited kid who enjoyed inflicting pain. She claimed he once hung a stray cat from a clothesline and set it on fire, and would take younger children into the woods, force them to strip, and terrorize them so badly their screams could be heard for blocks. As Ted grew older, his behavior became more sophisticated but no less troubling. He described searching through trash for pictures of naked women and consuming detective magazines filled with sexual violence. However, true to his manipulative nature, he later claimed in letters that he never, ever read fact detective magazines. He began consuming alcohol heavily and would prowl neighborhoods at night, looking through windows to watch women undressing. Psychologist Al Carlisle noted that Ted was already fantasizing about being someone else, someone important. This pattern of deception and fantasy would become central to his later crimes. Socially, Ted presented a confusing picture. He claimed to choose isolation because he couldn't understand interpersonal relationships, saying he didn't know what made people want to be friends. He endured bullying at Hunt Junior High School, where classmates poured cold water on him in the showers. However, at Woodrow Wilson High School, classmates remembered him as well-known and well-liked. Ted was arrested at least twice as a teenager for burglary and motor vehicle theft, though these records were later expunged. His transformation from a troubled child into what would become America's most notorious serial killer was already underway. After graduating from high school in 1965, Ted attended the University of Puget Sound for 1 year before transferring to the University of Washington to study Chinese. It was here that he met someone who profoundly impacted his life and potentially triggered his killing spree, Diane Edwards, known by several pseudonyms in Bundy literature but most commonly as Stephanie Brooks. Ted later described Edwards as the only woman I ever really loved. She was everything he admired, sophisticated, from a wealthy family, and seemingly unattainable. Their relationship represented both Ted's deepest desire for acceptance and his greatest vulnerability. In early 1968, Ted dropped out of college and worked a series of minimum-wage jobs. This period marked a significant decline in his stability. Edwards graduated that spring and left Washington for San Francisco. When Ted visited her later that year, their relationship came to an abrupt and devastating end. Edwards broke up with Ted, frustrated by what she described as his immaturity and lack of ambition. This rejection was a pivotal moment in Ted's life. Psychiatrist Dorothy Lewis later identified this crisis as probably the pivotal time in his development. Devastated by the breakup, Ted embarked on a journey that many experts believe marked the beginning of his transformation into a killer. He traveled to Colorado, then to Arkansas and Philadelphia, eventually enrolling at Temple University for 1 semester. During this time, he frequently visited New York City, where he immersed himself in violent pornography while nursing his wounds from the rejection. It was also during this period that Ted likely discovered his true parentage by locating his birth records in Vermont. The combination of romantic rejection and the discovery of his illegitimate birth created a perfect storm of rage and psychological trauma. Ted returned to Washington in fall 1969, where he met Elizabeth Klopfer, known in Bundy literature by various names including Meg Anders and Liz Kendall. Klopfer was a single mother from Utah working as a secretary at the UW School of Medicine. Their relationship continued for years, even past Ted's initial incarceration. Ted became a father figure to Klopfer's 3-year-old daughter Molly, remaining in her life until she was 10. However, as an adult, Molly revealed disturbing memories of Ted's inappropriate behavior, including physical abuse, sexual touching disguised as games, and incidents where he put her at risk. In mid-1970, Ted re-enrolled at UW as a psychology major, suddenly focused and goal-oriented. He became an honor student, well regarded by professors. This transformation was remarkable. The same person who had struggled academically was now excelling. In 1971, Ted took a job at Seattle's Suicide Hotline Crisis Center, where he met and Rule, a former police officer turned crime writer. Rule saw nothing disturbing in Ted's personality, describing him as kind, solicitous, and empathetic. The irony is staggering: a future serial killer counseling suicidal individuals while maintaining a facade of caring and empathy. After graduating from UW in 1972, Ted joined Governor Daniel J. Evans's re-election campaign. He showed remarkable cunning by posing as a college student to shadow Evans's opponent, recording his speeches for analysis. This demonstrated Ted's ability to deceive and manipulate even in professional settings. Evans was so impressed with Ted that he appointed him to the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee. Ted was later hired as an assistant to Ross Davis, chairman of the Washington State Republican Party. Davis described Ted as smart, aggressive, and a believer in the system. The ultimate irony came when Ted was accepted into law school at both the University of Puget Sound and the University of Utah, despite mediocre LSAT scores. His letters of recommendation from government officials opened doors that his academic performance alone could not. In summer 1973, during a business trip to California, Ted rekindled his relationship with Edwards. She was amazed at his transformation into a serious professional with apparent legal and political prospects. Ted continued dating Klopfer simultaneously, neither woman knew about the other. Ted courted Edwards intensively, discussing marriage and even introducing her to colleagues as his fiancée. Then, in January 1974, he executed what can only be described as calculated revenge. Ted abruptly broke off all contact with Edwards. When she finally reached him by phone a month later, demanding an explanation, he responded in a flat, calm voice, "Diane, I have no idea what you mean," and hung up. She never heard from him again. Ted later explained his motivation, "I just wanted to prove to myself that I could have married her." But Edwards understood the truth. Ted had spent years positioning himself to make her fall in love with him so he could reject her as she had rejected him. It was calculated, methodical revenge. By April 1974, Ted had stopped attending law school entirely. Young women were beginning to disappear in the Pacific Northwest, and America's most notorious serial killer had begun his reign of terror. The timing is chilling. Around the same time Ted ended his relationship with Edwards in January 1974, he launched his killing career. There's no consensus on when exactly Ted began killing, as he told different stories to different investigators, but his documented murders began in 1974. On January 4, 1974, shortly after midnight, Ted entered the basement apartment of 18-year-old Karen Sparks, a dancer and University of Washington student. He bludgeoned her with a metal rod from her bed frame, then sexually assaulted her with the same rod, causing extensive internal injuries and rupturing her bladder. Karen survived but was left with permanent brain damage, significant vision and hearing loss, and spent 10 days unconscious in the hospital. The brutality of this first attack established Ted's modus operandi: blunt force trauma followed by sexual assault. What's particularly disturbing is that Karen Sparks fit a specific physical type that would become Ted's preferred victim profile. On February 1st, Ted broke into the basement room of 21-year-old Linda and Healy, a UW student who broadcast morning radio weather reports for skiers. He beat her unconscious, dressed her in blue jeans, a white blouse, and boots, then carried her away. He later stated he drove Healy to a secluded area where he raped and murdered her. During the first half of 1974, female college students disappeared at the rate of approximately one per month. Each disappearance followed a similar pattern that was Ted's signature approach. On March 12th, Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old Evergreen State College student, left her dormitory to attend a jazz concert but never arrived. Ted later claimed he burned her skull in his girlfriend's fireplace, down to the last ash. April 17th brought the disappearance of Susan Elaine Rancourt, an 18-year-old Central Washington State College student. Two female students later reported encounters with a man in a sling asking for help carrying books to his brown Volkswagen Beetle, the first clear description of Ted's deception tactics. On May 6th, Roberta Kathleen Parks, 22, vanished from Oregon State University. Ted claimed he spotted her in the cafeteria, persuaded her to go to a bar, then tied and gagged her in his car, driving her back to Washington while raping her twice during the journey. June 1st saw the disappearance of Brenda Carroll Ball from the Flame Tavern parking lot near Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. She was last seen talking to a brown-haired man with his arm in a sling, another example of Ted's fake injury ruse. The most audacious crime occurred in the early hours of June 11th. when 18-year-old Georgianne Hawkins vanished while walking down a brightly lit alley between her boyfriend's dormitory and her sorority house. The next morning, 3 Seattle homicide detectives combed the entire alley on their hands and knees, finding nothing. Ted later revealed the chilling details. He lured Hawkins to his car, knocked her unconscious with a crowbar, handcuffed her, then drove to Issaquah where he strangled her and spent the entire night with her body. But here's the most brazen part. The next afternoon, in the midst of a major crime scene investigation, Ted returned to the very alley where he had abducted Hawkins and collected her earrings and a shoe he had left behind, departing unobserved. Detective Robert Keppel called it a feat so brazen that it astonishes police even today. Ted later admitted to revisiting Hawkins' corpse on 3 separate occasions. Ted's most daring and public crime occurred on July 14, 1974, at Lake Sammamish State Park in broad daylight. 4 female witnesses described an attractive young man in a white tennis outfit with his left arm in a sling, speaking with a light accent. Introducing himself as Ted, he asked for help unloading a sailboat from his Volkswagen Beetle. 3 women refused, but one accompanied him to his car, saw there was no sailboat, and fled. Witnesses watched Ted approach 23-year-old Janice and Ott, a probation caseworker, and leave with her. 4 hours later, 19-year-old Denise Marie Naslund left a picnic to use the restroom and never returned. Ted later told investigators that Ott was still alive when he returned with Naslund, forcing one to watch as he assaulted and murdered the other. This level of psychological torture demonstrates the sadistic pleasure Ted derived from his crimes. The Lake Sammamish abductions finally gave police detailed descriptions. Composite sketches were distributed, and multiple people, including Elizabeth Klopfer and Rule and a UW psychology professor, recognized Ted and reported him as a suspect. However, detectives receiving up to 200 tips daily thought it unlikely that a clean-cut law student with no adult criminal record could be responsible. This shows how effectively Ted's carefully constructed facade protected him. On September 6th, hunters discovered the skeletal remains of Ott and Naslund near Issaquah. An extra femur and vertebrae found at the site were later identified as belonging to Hawkins. 6 months later, the skulls and mandibles of Healy, Rancourt, Parks, and Ball were found on Taylor Mountain, where Ted frequently hiked. In August 1974, Ted received acceptance to University of Utah Law School and moved to Salt Lake City, leaving Klopfer in Seattle. This geographic shift marked a new phase in his killing career. He was learning to spread his crimes across multiple jurisdictions to avoid detection. At law school, Ted was devastated to discover that other students had some intellectual capacity that he lacked. He found classes incomprehensible, a blow to his carefully constructed self-image. This academic failure may have intensified his need to exert control through violence. Ted's killing resumed in Utah with characteristic brutality. On September 2nd, he raped and strangled an unidentified hitchhiker in Idaho, returning the next day to photograph and dismember the corpse. This reveals Ted's necrophilic tendencies. He didn't simply kill his victims. He maintained ongoing relationships with their bodies. October 2nd brought the abduction of 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox in Holiday, Utah. Ted claimed he kept her at his apartment for 24 hours before killing her. Her remains were never found despite Ted providing a location near Capitol Reef National Park. The pattern continued with 17-year-old Melissa Ann Smith, daughter of the Midvale police chief, who disappeared on October 18th. Her body was found 9 days later, with post-mortem examination indicating she may have remained alive for up to 7 days, a horrifying detail that suggests prolonged torture. October 31st brought the disappearance of Laura Ann Am, also 17, who vanished after leaving a Halloween party. Her body was found on Thanksgiving Day, and the medical examiner determined she had died 20 days after her disappearance. Both Smith and Am had been beaten, raped, sodomized, and strangled. Years later, Ted would describe his post-mortem rituals with these corpses, including shampooing their hair and applying makeup, revealing the extent of his necrophilic behavior and his need to maintain control over his victims even after death. Ted's confidence nearly proved his downfall on November 8, 1975, when he approached 18-year-old Carol Duranch at Fashion Place Mall in Murray, Utah. Identifying himself as Officer Roseland of the Murray Police Department, he told DeRanche that someone had attempted to break into her car and asked her to accompany him to file a complaint. When DeRanche pointed out they weren't heading toward the police station, Ted immediately pulled over and attempted to handcuff her. In his haste, he inadvertently fastened both handcuffs to the same wrist, allowing DeRanche to open the car door and escape. This mistake ultimately led to Ted's capture. Later that evening, 17-year-old Deborah Jean Kent disappeared from Viewmont High School after leaving a theater production. Outside the auditorium, investigators found a key that unlocked the handcuffs removed from DeRanche's wrist, the first concrete physical evidence linking Ted to his crimes. On August 16, 1975, Utah Highway Patrol Officer Bob Hayward arrested Ted in a Salt Lake City suburb after observing him cruising residential areas in the pre-dawn hours and fleeing at high speed. Searching Ted's Volkswagen, Hayward found what initially appeared to be burglary tools: a ski mask, handcuffs, rope, an ice pick, and other items. Ted's explanations were characteristically smooth. The ski mask was for skiing, he'd found the handcuffs in a dumpster, and the rest were common household items. However, Detective Jerry Thompson remembered the DeRanche case and Klopfer's earlier phone calls identifying Ted as a suspect. A search of Ted's apartment revealed a Colorado ski resort guide with the Wildwood Inn checked off, where Karen Campbell had been murdered, and a brochure for the Viewmont High School play where Deborah Kent had disappeared. Salt Lake City police placed Ted under 24-hour surveillance while Thompson traveled to Seattle to interview Klopfer. Her revelations were damning. She had discovered crutches, stolen plaster of Paris, surgical gloves, and a meat cleaver that was never used for cooking. She described how Ted became upset when she considered cutting her hair, which was long and parted in the middle like his victims. Most disturbingly, she would sometimes wake to find Ted under the covers with a flashlight, examining her body. When she confronted him about stolen items, he warned her, "If you tell anyone, I'll break your fucking neck." FBI analysis of Ted's Volkswagen yielded crucial evidence. Hairs matching Campbell's body were found, along with strands microscopically indistinguishable from Smith and DeRanche. As FBI specialist Robert Neal noted, finding hair from 3 different victims who had never met in one vehicle would be a coincidence of mind-boggling rarity. On October 2, 1975, DeRanche immediately identified Ted in a lineup as Officer Roseland. There was insufficient evidence to charge him with Kent's murder, but enough for aggravated kidnapping in the DeRanche case. In February 1976, Ted stood trial. Acting on his attorney's advice, he waived his right to a jury trial due to negative publicity. After a 4-day bench trial, Judge Stuart Hansen Jr. found Ted guilty and sentenced him to 1 to 15 years in Utah State Prison. In October 1976, Colorado authorities charged Ted with Karen Campbell's murder. After waiving extradition proceedings, he was transferred to Aspen in January 1977. This move provided Ted with opportunities he had been planning for. On June 7, 1977, Ted was transported from Garfield County Jail to Pitkin County Courthouse for a preliminary hearing. As his own attorney, he was allowed to appear without handcuffs or shackles. During a recess, Ted asked to visit the law library, where he opened a window and jumped from the 2nd story, injuring his ankle. Ted's escape was initially successful. He shed outer clothing and limped through Aspen while roadblocks were established. He hiked up Aspen Mountain, broke into a hunting cabin, and stole supplies. However, after 2 days of wandering lost in the forest, he made a critical error. Instead of continuing south toward his intended destination of Crested Butte, Ted walked back north toward Aspen. On June 13th, cold, sleep-deprived, and in constant pain, he stole a car at an Aspen golf course. 2 police officers noticed his erratic driving and pulled him over. He had been free for 6 days. Back in Glenwood Springs Jail, Ted ignored advice to remain put. The case against him was actually weakening. Pretrial motions were resolving in his favor and evidence was being ruled inadmissible. A rational defendant might have realized he stood a good chance of acquittal. Instead, Ted assembled an elaborate escape plan. He acquired floor plans of the jail and hacksaw blades from other inmates. Over 6 months, visitors, particularly Carol and Boone, smuggled in $500 in cash. Ted sawed through steel reinforcing bars in his cell's ceiling, having lost 35 pounds to fit through the opening. On December 30th, 1977, with most jail staff on Christmas break, Ted executed his plan. He piled books and files in his bed to simulate his sleeping body, climbed into the crawl space, broke through the ceiling into the chief jailer's apartment, changed into street clothes, and walked out the front door. The jail's skeleton crew didn't discover the escape until noon on December 31st, more than 17 hours later. By then, Ted had stolen a car, driven to Vail, caught a bus to Denver, and boarded a flight to Chicago. From Chicago, Ted traveled to Ann Arbor, Michigan, then stole a car and drove to Atlanta, where he boarded a bus to Tallahassee, Florida. He arrived on January 8, 1978, renting a room under the alias Chris Hagen near Florida State University. Ted later claimed he initially intended to find legitimate employment and refrain from criminal activity. However, when a construction job application required identification he couldn't provide, he reverted to shoplifting and stealing from women's wallets. In the early hours of January 15, 1978, exactly 1 week after arriving in Tallahassee, Ted committed perhaps his most brutal crimes. He entered Florida State University's Chi Omega sorority house through a rear door with a faulty locking mechanism. Beginning around 2:45 a.m., Ted launched a frenzied attack that lasted less than 15 minutes but left 4 women brutalized and 2 dead. He bludgeoned 21-year-old Margaret Elizabeth Bowman with a piece of oak firewood as she slept, then strangled her with a nylon stocking. He then attacked 20-year-old Lisa Janet Levy, beating her unconscious, strangling her, tearing off one of her nipples, biting deeply into her left buttock, and sexually assaulting her with a hair mist bottle. In adjoining bedrooms, he attacked Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler, breaking jaws and causing severe injuries. The speed and brutality of these attacks were unprecedented in Ted's criminal career. Tallahassee detectives determined that 4 attacks occurred in less than 15 minutes, within earshot of more than 30 witnesses who heard nothing. After leaving Chi Omega, Ted walked 8 blocks and attacked 21-year-old FSU student Cheryl Thomas in her basement apartment, dislocating her shoulder and fracturing her jaw and skull in 5 places. She survived but was left with permanent hearing damage. On February 9th, Ted drove 150 miles east to Jacksonville in a stolen FSU van. In a parking lot, he approached 14-year-old Leslie Parmenter, identifying himself as Richard Burton, Fire Department. He retreated when her older brother arrived, but this near miss would prove significant. That afternoon, Ted backtracked to Lake City. On February 10th, at Lake City Junior High School, 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach was summoned to retrieve a forgotten purse and never returned to class. 7 weeks later, her partially mummified remains were found in a pig farrowing shed. Forensic experts determined she had been raped before having her throat cut and genitals mutilated. Kimberly Leach was Ted's final victim, marking the end of his killing spree but not the end of his ability to cause pain and suffering. On February 15th, with insufficient funds and police closing in, Ted stole a car and fled Tallahassee. 3 days later, around 1 a.m., Pensacola police officer David Lee stopped Ted near the Alabama state line after discovering his Volkswagen was stolen. When told he was under arrest, Ted kicked Lee's legs and attempted to flee. After a brief chase and struggle, Lee subdued and arrested Ted. In the vehicle were 3 sets of FSU student IDs, 21 stolen credit cards, and the disguise worn during the Jacksonville incident. As Lee transported his suspect, unaware he had captured an FBI 10 Most Wanted fugitive, he heard Ted say, "I wish you had killed me." In May 1978, a Florida grand jury indicted Ted for the Chi Omega murders. His trial began in June 1979, becoming the first nationally televised murder trial in United States history. Despite having 5 court-appointed attorneys, Ted insisted on handling much of his defense himself. A plea bargain was negotiated offering Ted life imprisonment in exchange for guilty pleas to killing Levy, Bowman, and Leach. Prosecutors were amenable because they feared losing at trial. Ted saw this as a tactical move. He could plead guilty, wait for evidence to deteriorate and witnesses to die, then file a motion to set aside the plea. However, at the last minute, Ted refused the deal. As defense attorney Mike Minerva explained, it made him realize he was going to have to stand up in front of the whole world and say he was guilty. He just couldn't do it. Crucial testimony came from Chi Omega members who placed Ted at the scene and identified bite mark evidence on Lisa Levy's buttock that matched castings of Ted's teeth. On July 24, 1979, after less than 7 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted Ted of murder and assault charges. Judge Edward Coward imposed death sentences. During his second trial for Kimberly Leach's murder, Ted took advantage of an obscure Florida law allowing marriage declarations in court. While questioning character witness Carol and Boone, Ted asked her to marry him. She accepted, and they were legally married in the courtroom. On February 10, 1980, Ted received his third death sentence for Leach's murder. As the sentence was announced, he reportedly shouted, "Tell the jury they were wrong." In October 1981, Boone gave birth to Ted's daughter, Rose. While conjugal visits weren't officially allowed, inmates were known to bribe guards for intimate time with female visitors. Shortly after the Leach trial, Ted began interviews with authors Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth. Speaking mostly in third person to avoid the stigma of confession, he finally began divulging details of his crimes. Ted revealed his career as a prolific thief, confirming Klopfer's suspicions that he had shoplifted virtually everything he owned. More disturbing were his insights into his psychology. The ultimate possession was, in fact, the taking of the life, and then the physical possession of the remains. FBI Special Agent William Hagmaier developed a unique relationship with Ted, who confided his deepest thoughts about murder. After a while, murder is not just a crime of lust or violence, Hagmaier related. It becomes possession. They are part of you, and you are forever one, and the grounds where you kill them become sacred to you. With appeals exhausted and execution imminent, Ted agreed to speak frankly with investigators. He confessed to Keppel that he had committed all 8 Washington and Oregon homicides for which he was the prime suspect, describing 3 additional unknown victims. Ted's manipulation continued even facing death. He withheld details about victim locations, hoping to trade incomplete information for execution delays. This bones for time scheme only deepened authorities' resolve to see the execution carried out on schedule. When lobbying for clemency began, victims' families refused to petition for Ted's life. As prosecutor Nelson wrote, they didn't need his confession. They already believed the victims were dead and that Ted had killed them. Even facing execution, Bundy continued his lifelong pattern of manipulation. In his final interview with evangelical psychologist James Dobson, he blamed his crimes on pornography and violent media, claiming these materials had corrupted him and turned him into a killer. However, most experts view this as a final manipulation designed to shift blame away from himself. In earlier interviews, Bundy had dismissed pornography's role in his development, and he had given contradictory accounts of his exposure to such materials throughout his life. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair at 7:16 a.m. His last words were directed to his attorney and a Methodist minister, "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." Hundreds of people gathered outside the prison, singing, dancing, and setting off fireworks as the execution was carried out. Ted was cremated in Gainesville, his ashes scattered in Washington state's Cascade Range. The story of Ted Bundy didn't end with his execution. In 2011, a full DNA profile for Ted Bundy was uploaded to the National CODIS, Combined DNA Index System, database, where it exists alongside the DNA profiles of millions of other convicted offenders. This development has allowed investigators to potentially link Bundy to cold cases across the country. Ted Bundy's crimes continue to impact law enforcement policies and investigative practices nearly 50 years after his killing spree. His case helped establish many modern investigative techniques, including the use of behavioral profiling and multi-jurisdictional task forces. Recent academic research has suggested that Bundy's criminal career may have been far more extensive than officially recorded. Criminologist Matt DeLisi's research indicates that Bundy's crimes likely began much earlier and included many more victims than the confirmed 30 murders. The use of genetic genealogy and advanced DNA techniques continues to provide new possibilities for linking Bundy to unsolved cases, though many questions remain unanswered about the full extent of his crimes. Multiple psychiatric evaluations produced varying diagnoses for Bundy. While some experts initially suggested bipolar disorder or multiple personality disorder, the consensus eventually settled on antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, with strong narcissistic traits. Using the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, PCLR, Bundy scored 39 out of 40, indicating an almost perfect psychopath. He displayed classic traits including superficial charm, lack of empathy, absence of guilt, and manipulative behavior. Dr. Dorothy Otno Lewis, who had initially been skeptical about the existence of true psychopaths, concluded, "I always tell my graduate students that if they can find me a real, true psychopath, I'll buy them dinner. I never thought they existed, but I think Ted may have been that rare specimen, a true psychopath, without any remorse or empathy at all." All of Bundy's confirmed victims were white females, mostly from middle-class backgrounds, typically between 15 and 25 years old. Most were college students with long, straight hair parted in the middle, resembling Diane Edwards, the woman who had rejected him. Bundy's methodology evolved over time. Early attacks involved breaking into homes and assaulting sleeping victims. Later, he developed elaborate ruses, often feigning injury with fake casts or slings to gain sympathy and assistance. His charismatic personality and clean-cut appearance allowed him to approach victims without raising suspicion. The secondary crime sites were carefully selected, often considerable distances from the abduction locations. Bundy would transport victims to isolated areas where he could assault and murder them without interruption, frequently returning to engage in acts with the corpses. Bundy remains a suspect in numerous unsolved cases across the country. Some notable examples include the 1961 disappearance of 8-year-old Anne-Marie Burr from Tacoma, which occurred when Bundy was 14 years old. Multiple murders in New Jersey, Vermont, and other states during periods when Bundy's whereabouts were unknown. Cases in states he visited or lived in during unaccounted for periods of his life. However, DNA testing has also ruled Bundy out of some cases previously attributed to him, including the 2023 resolution of Rita Patricia Curran's 1971 murder in Burlington, Vermont, which was solved using genetic genealogy techniques. Bundy's case fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches serial crime investigations. His ability to operate across multiple jurisdictions highlighted the need for better communication and coordination between agencies. The development of the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was partly inspired by cases like Bundy's. The case also demonstrated the importance of physical evidence and the limitations of eyewitness testimony. Bundy's chameleon-like ability to change his appearance made visual identification unreliable, emphasizing the need for forensic evidence. Ted Bundy's case continues to fascinate and horrify more than 3 decades after his execution. His story has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and films, making him perhaps the most famous serial killer in American history. However, this notoriety has also had troubling effects. Anne Rule noted that after Bundy's execution, she received disturbing correspondence from women who had been infatuated with him, viewing his death as a tragic loss rather than justice served. The story of Ted Bundy represents more than just the crimes of a single individual. It reveals the capacity for evil that can exist within someone who appears completely normal, even admirable. Bundy's ability to fool so many people for so long, from family members and romantic partners to law enforcement professionals and legal experts, demonstrates the sophisticated nature of psychopathic manipulation. His case changed how we understand serial crime and influenced decades of criminal justice practices. The ongoing use of his DNA profile in cold case investigations means that Bundy's impact on law enforcement continues even today. Perhaps most importantly, Bundy's story serves as a cautionary tale about the danger of charismatic predators who use society's trusting nature against innocent victims. His crimes remind us that evil rarely announces itself. It often comes disguised as charm, intelligence, and apparent normalcy. It also reminds us that our assumptions about what a killer looks like can be dangerously wrong. What aspects of the Bundy case do you find most disturbing? His ability to deceive so many people, the failure of multiple systems to stop him sooner, or the lasting impact his crimes have had on our understanding of criminal behavior? Do you think his childhood trauma explains his actions, or was he simply born without empathy? How has this case changed your perspective on personal safety and trusting strangers? How do you think modern technology and DNA testing might have changed the course of his crimes if they had been available in the 1970s? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this deep dive into criminal psychology interests you and you want to explore more cases like this, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more investigations into history's most notorious cases. We have upcoming episodes covering other notorious serial killers, unsolved mysteries that still puzzle investigators today, and the evolution of criminal forensics. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on Ted Bundy's case, and let us know which criminal case you'd like us to cover next. Your engagement helps us create the content you want to see. Remember, understanding these cases isn't about glorifying the criminals, but about learning to recognize the warning signs and ensuring such tragedies are prevented in the future. The victims of Ted Bundy deserve to be remembered not just as statistics, but as individuals whose lives were cut tragically short by a master manipulator who fooled the world. Stay safe, stay aware, and we'll see you in the next episode.